Chapter 13. The Big Day arrives. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of the Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people had gathered to watch the five lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. The crowds were pushing and shouting, and policemen with arms linked were trying to hold them all back from the gates. Right beside the gates, in a small group that was carefully shielded from the crowd by the police, the five famous children together with the grown-ups who had come with them. The tall, bony figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and besides him, holding it tightly onto his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children except Charlie, who had both their mothers and fathers with them, and it was a good thing that they had, otherwise the whole party might have got out of hand. They were so eager to get going that their parents were having to hold them back by force to prevent them from climbing over the gates. "Be patient," cried the fathers. "Be still, it's not time yet, it's 10 o'clock. Behind him, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of the people in the crowd. "There's Violet Beauregarde," he heard someone shouting. "That's her all right, I remember her face from the newspapers." "And you know what?" somebody else shouted. "She's still chewing that dreadful piece of old gum. She's had it for 3 months. You look at her jaw, they're still working on it." "Who's the big fat boy?" "That's Augustus Gloop." "So he is." "Oh, he's enormous. Fantastic." "Who's the kid with the low major stenciled on his wind cheater?" "That's Mike TV. He's a television fiend. He must be going crazy. Look at all those toy pistols he's got hanging all over him." "The one I want to see is Veruca Salt," shouted another voice in the crowd. "She's a girl whose father bought 500,000 chocolate bars and then made the workers unwrap them. He gives her anything he wants, absolutely anything. She has awful screaming to get it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking, I call it." "Which one do you think he is?" That one over there on the left, the little girl with the silver mink coat." "Well, which one's Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie Bucket? He must be that skinny little shrimp standing behind the old fellow who just looks like a skeleton. Very close to us, just there. Can you see him? Why hasn't he got a coat on him? It's cold weather. Don't ask me, maybe he can't afford one. Goodness me, he must be freezing." Charlie, standing only a few paces away from the speaker, gave Grandpa Joe's hand a squeeze, and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock began striking 10. Very slowly, with a loud creaking of rusty hinges, the great iron gates of the factory began to swing open. Then the crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping around, and all eyes were fixed upon the gate. "There he is!" someone shouted. "That's him!" And so it was. Chapter 14. Mr. Willy Wonka. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory, and what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of beautiful plum-coloured velvet. His trousers were bottle green, his gloves were pearly white, and in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee, and his eyes were the most marvellously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter, and oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quite jerky little movements with his head, cocking it this way and that way, and taking everything in with those bright twinkling eyes of his. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a clever, quick old squirrel from the park. Suddenly, he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide, and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my little friends, welcome to the factory." His voice was high and fluty. "Will you come forward one at a time, please, and bring your tickets, and show me your golden ticket, and give me your name. Who's first?" The fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, "my dear boy, how good it is to see you, delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And are these your parents? Oh, how lovely. Come in, that's right, step through the gates." Mr. Willy Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I ever thought that Veruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot, but I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you came, dear me. This is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father, how are you, Mr. Sol? And Mrs. Sol, overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket's quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet Beauregarde and Mike TV, came forward to have their tickets examined, and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small, nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie," cried Mr. Wonka, well, there you are. You're the one who just found your ticket yesterday, aren't you?" "Oh, yes, I read about it all in this morning papers, just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad, so happy for you. And this your grandfather, delighted to meet you, sir, overjoyed. Interacted, enchanted, alright, excellent. Is everybody in? Now 5 children? Yes, good. Now will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin. But do keep together, please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of proceedings. Oh dear me, no. Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gates closing slowly behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took a last look at them, then the gates closed with a clang. All sight of the outside world disappeared. Here we are, cried Mr. Wonka, trotting along in front of the group. Through this red door, please. That's right, it's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of all the workers. My workers are used to extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze. But who are the workers? Asked Douglas's group. All in good time, my dear boy, said Mr. Willy Wonka. Be patient. You shall see everything as we go along. Are you all inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you. Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him as far as he could see. The corridor was so wide that a car could have easily been driven along it. The walls were pale pink, the lighting was soft and pleasant. How lovely and warm, whispered Charlie. I know, what a marvellous smell, answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long deep sniff. All of the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixing up in the air around them. The smell of roasting coffee and burnt sugar and melting chocolate and mint and violets and crushed hazelnuts and apple blossom and caramel and lemon peel. And far away in the distance, from the heart of the great factory, came a muffled roar of energy as though some monstrous, gigantic machine was spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. Now this, my dear children, said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice, is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on the pegs over there, and then follow me? That's the way. Good. Everyone ready? Come on then, here we go. He trotted off rapidly down the corridor with the tails of his plum-coloured velvet coat flapping behind him, and the visitors all hurried after him. It was quite a large party of people when you come to think of it. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all, so you can imagine that there was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hustled and bustled down the passage trying to keep up with the swift little figure in front of them. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka, get a move on please, we'll never get round today if you dawdle like this. Soon he turned right off the main corridor into another slightly narrower passage. Then he turned left, then left again, then right, then left, then right, then right, then left. The place was like a gigantic rabbit warren, with passages leading this way and that way in every direction. Don't you let go of my hand, Charlie, whispered Grandpa Joe. Notice how all these passages are sloping downwards? So called out Mr. Wonka. We are now going underground. All the most important rooms in my factory are deep below the surface. Why is that? Someone asked. There wouldn't be nearly enough space for them up on top, answered Mr. Wonka. These rooms you are going to see are enormous. They're bigger than football fields, and no building in the world would be big enough to have them all. But down here, underneath the ground, I've got all the space I want. There's no limit, just as long as I hollow it out. Mr. Wonka turned right, he turned left, and he turned right again. The passages were sloping steeper and steeper downhill now. Then suddenly, Mr. Wonka stopped. In front of him there was a shiny metal door. The party crowded around. On the door in large letters, it said, The Chocolate Room.